my left is Walter Russell Mead, and if you don't know him, Google him, and you will be floored that he is actually a faculty member here and part of Hamilton School. He is the world's leading journalist when it comes to international affairs, grand strategy, strategy and statecraft. I could go on and on. Here he is the professor of strategy and statecraft at Hamilton School. He is the Ravenel B. Curry Distinguished Fellow in Strategy and Statesmanship at Hudson Institute, and he's a Global View columnist at the Wall Street Journal. Need I go on? I mean, that says it all right there. So we're always very lucky when Walter can give a presentation for us or give us a talk. So we're really looking forward to what he has to say. And to my right is my esteemed junior colleague, Dr. Patrick Hulme. He's a professor. Patrick has a PhD and a JD, a law degree. So he spent a lot of time in school. Despite the fact that he looks like a cool guy, he was probably a nerd to be able to get both degrees like that.
Ask my wife.
All right, so he's assistant professor of law and political science at Hamilton School. He's a political scientist with a focus on congressional executive relations, so he'll give us the Trump side of things and Congress, and Walter will give us the international relations aspect. Okay, his current project, this is Patrick, Dr. Hulme. He's working on a book called In the Shadow of Congress, which challenges the conventional view of an all-powerful commander-in-chief. Wow, how apropos. As we have somebody who looks in the mirror and thinks he's an all-powerful commander-in-chief. So, not that I have a problem with that. But anyways, I'm Mike Legere. I'm a member of the War, Statecraft, and Strategy faculty. We just launched our major this spring, and I'm hoping that's why I only have 2 of you in my Napoleon class, that will pick up. But in the fall, we're starting our graduate version. So if you have any questions or any interest in war, statecraft, and strategy, come by my office or shoot me an email. I'm going to turn it over to, who's going first? Dr. Hulme.
I will be going. And who has the clicker? There we go. Thank you. I have one slide, only one slide. So while this is warming up, who knows whether Congress approved the use of force? We're in a pretty sizable armed conflict right now. Did Congress approve the use of force? For this use of force, the answer is no, they did not formally approve the use of force. In fact, President Trump wrote to Congress 2 days ago saying, I acted pursuant to my constitutional authority as commander-in-chief. And so in the news right now, you're going to hear quite a bit how essentially the president is kind of running over Congress. It's a pretty typical story, not just President Trump, but maybe especially President Trump, and that Congress essentially is helpless. There's nothing that Congress can do about this. That's what the news will tell you. That's a cue. I'm going to tell you something slightly differently. So what I've got here is I've used artificial intelligence, but in a responsible way. It actually works. I can talk more about it later. What I've done here is taken all expressions from lawmakers, so think like tweets. We have this thing from 100 years ago called Facebook that sometimes dinosaurs use, from Facebook, press releases, floor speeches, etc. Everything we can get data on, all members of Congress. And the dots are going to represent each kind of observation. They say something. Red is Republican, big shocker. Blue is Democrat. And it's just kind of these dots. They're ordered on the y-axis by whether it was supporting the use of force or like heavily implying. So if it's Lindsey Graham being like, the protesters are getting killed, we need to hold the regime accountable, we need to take a very, very firm stand. Something like that might count. And then down here, opposed, this is going to be the opposite, where it says we don't want a war, or President Trump needs congressional authorization. We don't want a conflict. You can have stuff in between. And then the trend lines are just showing you averages. Over time, blue being Democrats, red being Republicans, black is just overall for Congress. What do you guys notice? And actually, before that, here, this is when the use of force started. So we've got about 2 months of data before this. What are you noticing? Go ahead.
Plummets.
It does go down slightly, although at the end it's still actually more positive than negative. You're right. So what's going on here is essentially as deployments are being made, suddenly the Democrats are saying, we don't want this, but the Republicans are still supporting it. There's actually more Democrats supporting it than there are Republicans opposed. So it does, you're right, it does go down, but it's still overall slightly supportive and has a little bit of majority. What else? Yep.
It seems that right about the time that I guess taking of Maduro in Venezuela happened, that Democrats were most supportive, actually.
Yeah, well, it's actually, so you had protests start here, and this is when the regime in Iran, they killed tens of thousands of innocent protesters. And a lot of members of Congress actually calling to do something, including Democrats, a lot saying, do something, stay out of war. Can you do both those things? That's a question. But just to say there's a lot. So there's no vote from Congress before the president uses force, but what do we know? There's a lot of statements from Congress, right? It's not like Congress is quiet. So what the plot is kind of showing here is that Congress, in a way, is often having its voice heard in these crises to an extent that's usually not recognized if you're just watching the news and they say, oh my gosh, the president used force without going to Congress and getting authorization beforehand. Usually what happens is something exactly like this, where crisis brews for a bit. They have an idea, you can see what's going on in the political ecosystem. And if you're an advisor to the president, you're looking at this, and you're at least going, do we have at least some minimum level of support? So here, if you're President Trump, how many houses of Congress do you have? You have both, right? You have both houses of Congress. They're supporting this. A couple Republicans aren't supporting this, but actually more Democrats are supporting this than they're opposed to this. So at the end of the day, you can look at this and say, you know what? I've got some political cover here. I've got a little bit. And so what I'm going to be looking at the next few weeks and months is how far a president's going to be willing to go given that weak support, right? It's a little bit more than 50-50, doesn't have formal authorization, but he has some support. And my guess is he's not going to do things that are going to cause a whole lot of American casualties. So I think right now there's been 6 American deaths. I would be surprised if you started getting north of like 30. Let's say. It's not going to be anything, so like the Iraq War, for example, that's almost 5,000 deaths. We're not going to get, my guess, we're not going to get anywhere even close to that because that support's going to evaporate very quickly, and the president hasn't gotten formal authorization. So all that's to say, a game is being played here. If you're just looking at the news, it wasn't authorized. Congress must be completely impotent. I don't think that's the case. I think that what Congress is doing was actually taken into account by the president, and that's just the Republicans. Now, most Democrats here, you can see, what are most Democrats? Most of them are opposed. There's a couple actually that were supporting this. One actually, there was a proposed war powers resolution constraining the president before he used force, and one Democrat called it the Ayatollah Protection Act, saying this is ridiculous, right? And actually, one of my favorite things was a reporter the week before these attacks. She wrote this really good story, and she was talking to a lot of the Democratic aides on the Senate side. And this is what she writes. This is a week before the attack, not this week, the week before. Many top Democrats privately believe Iran will ultimately have to be confronted militarily. Not Democrats, or excuse me, not Republicans, although they do too, Democrats. But they also understand that openly backing another regime change war in the Middle East would be politically toxic. The preferred outcome, according to a senior foreign policy aide to Senate Democrat leader Chuck Schumer, is what? What's the preferred outcome here? It's going to be politically risky, but we know this needs to happen. What's your best case outcome?
You kill the regime leader and then the people take over themselves.
Also true, but do you want to be, if you're a politician, do you want to be responsible for that?
Well, the best case is that the Republicans are responsible for this.
And they say their best case scenario is that Trump acts unilaterally, weakening Iran while absorbing the domestic political backlash. So we'll see what happens. I suspect It'll be shocking to all of you. Politicians, are very strategic actors, and sometimes they do things that don't quite meet the eye. All this is just to say that often Congress is having an influence in these decisions, and it's just difficult to tell if you're only looking for whether it's formally approving the use of force ex ante. So I think now we're going to turn to Professor Mead, and then we're going to open up to Q&A after his comments.
Okay. Well, I see some of the students, some of the survivors of the midterm in my class are struggling up. So we have proof positive that at least the midterm is not fatal in my, not universally fatal in my class. Right. So, what I do is I try to write a newspaper column for the Wall Street Journal every week. When there's a lot of news, I have to write 2 columns, and so I had to write 2 columns this week. Who knows, I may have to write 2 columns next week. I hate war. But what I'm trying to do here is help my readers who, as you can imagine, think about the Wall Street Journal, kind of a business newspaper. So you'd have some people who are CEOs of different companies, and when they read the paper, they want help, what I have to make decisions. And so I need analysis that helps me make decisions. They don't necessarily, one thing I've learned over the years, you guys may be different, but when I talk to audiences about American foreign policy, they're often less interested in whether Walter Mead thinks this is a good foreign policy. They want to understand, what is the policy? Why does the president who's pushing the policy push it? What does he think he's doing? And then what are the politics around the policy? Is the U.S. going to keep doing this or not? They're much more interested in that. And I'm going to assume that that's what you're more interested in. But obviously we're going to have a Q&A, and if you want to look at some, ask some other questions, feel free. Okay, so we look at what's going on here, and I think the first thing that we have to say is that for President Trump, beyond any doubt, this is the single biggest political gamble of his career. If, from his point of view, suppose it goes really well, suppose in the next couple of days the Iranian government starts to fall apart, the people who've been protesting on the streets take over, and it turns out they're like grateful that America and Israel have helped to free them. And so instead of being the biggest headache for the United States in the Middle East, Iran wants to be our friend. They want to work with us to rebuild their economy, and they like democracy. Okay, President Trump, I think even the Norwegians might have to give him the Nobel Peace Prize in that case. I don't know. Just anecdotally, by the way, on the day it was announced that President Obama had won the Nobel Peace Prize, the United States on that day actually bombed the moon. We did. The reason, it was a scientific experiment. We were bombing the moon to see whether the shock waves going through the moon after getting bombed would show that there was water there that you could use for moon colonies. But I did think that was great. Bomb the moon. And as far as I know, we're the only country that's ever bombed the moon. Right. For democracy. Yeah. All right. So, so why did Trump decide to do, why did he try to do this? Because obviously if it doesn't work, we've got midterm elections. Imagine the midterms come and the price of gas is $5 a gallon, right? The stock market has gone down 20%. And he's having to announce that he's sending ground troops into the Middle East and we're taking casualties. All right? That is not the scenario that Donald Trump would like. And that would put his presidency into an entirely different situation. So part of why he's doing this, I think, is he obviously thinks his chances of winning the gamble are greater than his chances of losing. This is not a dig at President Trump. Any political leader would need to sort of try to calculate whether or not you can achieve something like this. He thinks he sees a way. Now we might ask, why does he think he sees a way? What is his vision of victory? And I would say we saw some of it in Venezuela. In some ways, this takes us back to something very 19th century. Have any of you heard of the phrase gunboat diplomacy? Okay, back in the old days, when, say, some country in the global south had borrowed a bunch of money from banks in Paris or London or something and then wasn't paying it back, what the country whose money wasn't getting paid back would often do is send some ships to the main port of that country, take control of the customs houses, where all the imports and exports go. And that would mean they would be able to control the revenue, the main source of revenue that the government would get. And they would divide up the revenue. This much for the local government, this much for the creditors. All right? It was not a particularly popular thing in the global south for reasons, I probably don't have to explain to you. All right? But gunboat diplomacy was a real thing. And compared to, say, what the U.S. did or tried to do in Iraq and Afghanistan, it had a lot of advantages. Because in those countries, in those wars, we had to occupy the whole country, which meant providing security all over the country, a lot of troops, long supply lines, complicated political relationships. And at the end of the day, the American people kind of got tired of the whole thing. So what Trump seems to have figured out in his own mind, I think, is that particularly with oil exporting countries whose economies are linked heavily to oil like Venezuela and Iran, if you can take control of their oil trade, right, you can have the same kind of power that in the 19th century you could get with gunboat diplomacy. So in the case of Venezuela, you don't need to even occupy the customs house. Your navy offshore can stop Venezuela from selling oil unless it's okay with you, so that you can control the revenue, and then you find people inside Venezuela who want some revenue, and you're able to work out an arrangement, which is more or less what he's trying in Venezuela. Now, it's very complicated. It may not ultimately work out. All kinds of things are happening. International life is almost never as simple as it looks like when you start something. People are complicated. Countries are complicated. But that's what I think President Trump is seeing. And so he looks at Iran, and he thinks something like that could work there too. That you can control Iran's ability to export oil, which means that that the government of Iran has the resources that you say it can have. So it becomes in Iran's interest to choose a government that works with you rather than against you. And so I think this is Trump's idea of the kind of thing he'd like, the way he thinks things will go in Iran, and why he thinks he can do this on the cheap. And in favor of his idea, people say, well, the mullahs, they're very religious, they're very sincere, and it's a suicide cult and so on. Well, it is for some of them, but they've been in power for almost 50 years, and I really don't want to disillusion any of the young ears that are with us tonight, but many people, even who start life as sincere believers in a cause as students, over time become just a little bit cynical and greedy. There's a mortgage to pay. I want to send the kids to college. We need a summer place. My wife is really mad because we haven't redone the kitchen in 10 years. And so, so that original revolutionary religious spirit that kind of powered the Ayatollahs back in the 1970s and 80s begins to fade over time. And so Trump is constantly, if you pay attention to his speeches, he's saying things like, I'm talking to people on the inside. I think we'll get a very good arrangement. You'll notice just in Venezuela, he did not side with the democracy leader who had, we think, won the last election. She's kind of been pushed off to the side. In the same way in Iran, he's pushed the Shah's son, young Reza Pahlavi, off to the side because he thinks he can do a better deal with the people running Iran now. So I think that's the president's idea of what he hopes to happen. And honestly, if he does make it work, it will be, from the standpoint of power politics, a very consequential thing. We can talk about morality, and we can talk about international law, and we can talk about the War Powers Act, all kinds of things like that. But just in the space where Trump operates and the kind of very pragmatic calculations he makes, I think you can see why he would find this appealing. And as someone himself who is maybe just a little bit cynical and jaded also, he naturally believes that a lot of other people are like him. And if you've been in the casino business and the New York real estate business and the reality television business, you get a kind of a low view of human nature. You come to the conclusion that people are kind of stupid and greedy. I mean, honestly, all right, look at a casino, and the thing about casinos is the bigger they are and the fancier they are with bright lights and the more floor shows they have, the more people go there. But you know what? They don't build casinos with the money that gamblers win, right? They build casinos with the money they take from their customers. And whatever they spend on that casino, there's profit beyond what they spend. So the casino is like saying in huge bright lights, lose your money here. And people just go in. All right. And so Trump, I think a lot of Trump's politics make a certain amount of sense when you think about the environment that he works in. Okay, so by the way, there's a word I haven't mentioned here, Israel. You're hearing some people saying that the reason Trump is doing what he's doing is because the Israelis are pushing him to do it. I don't think it's working like that at all. I think the opportunity that I've described is an opportunity that Trump sees himself. What the Israelis are doing is that they're showing him a path to getting what he already wants. That is, with their intelligence penetration of Iran, they can help do the targets. With their military assets, they, in the first war last June, the Israelis actually knocked out all the air defense before the American bombing came. So the Israelis, in that sense, have figured out where Trump wants to go, and they've made it, they've cleared the path for him. And that is, and he, I think, remains completely in control. They have very little leverage over him. He has a lot of leverage over them. I think it's the way he sees it. All right. So that's why he might want to do this. Why would he want to do it now? And I think there are reasons, good military reasons. And that is, for most of the diplomacy that we've had with Iran over the years has been around the fear of Iran getting a nuclear weapon. And that was President Obama's JCPOA, his nuclear deal. And that's what every American president has been saying really since the 1970s. This Iranian government cannot have a nuclear weapon. And it's not only because they might use it again to destroy Israel, which I don't think we would like, but even more, if they have a nuclear weapon, then they have the ability to control the flow of oil in and out of the Middle East, and that's huge political power. They can cause a depression. We don't need that oil. We did back in the 70s and the 80s. We don't need it now. But we also don't need the price of oil to go up to $800 a barrel in Japan and in Europe and cause huge economic depressions, which throw millions of Americans out of work, send the stock market down the tubes, all of these things. And we don't want this regime to have that blackmail capability. All right, so fine, then we smashed their nuclear facilities. I think we did a reasonably good job in the summer. So some people are saying, so why go back to it now? Why do you go back to it? And I think the answer is ballistic missiles. That Iran has continued to build up its stocks of ballistic missiles. And they're different from drones and smaller missiles. They're much harder to stop, all right? And they're adding to their stockpiles every week. You've noticed that since the attacks came, actually on my phone, I have this app that lets me know every time there's a big missile alert in Israel. And the last few days, this thing has been going wild. But again, not just Israel. The Iranians have stopped the flow of oil out of the Gulf using ballistic missile attacks against targets in Arab countries, including their friends, by the way, like Qatar. And so the oil is not getting through the Straits of Hormuz. So already that's a problem. But imagine if we sort of said, okay, the Iranian nuclear program is frozen. Let's not worry about the missiles. I think you quickly get to a point where Iran has enough missiles that you can't do an attack anymore. That their missiles can deter an attack because they could be even better than they are now in terms of shutting down the oil supply for a much longer time, wreaking more havoc. In some ways, the real fear is that you have these big cities on the Gulf. They all depend on water desalinization plants because otherwise you don't get a city of 10 million people in a desert. And so a missile that took out the desalinization plants or took out the power supplies to the desalinization plants could cause a massive crisis. So in that sense, Iran has managed to find a way to in a sense, get a lot of what nuclear weapons would give you with ballistic missiles alone. And that's why in the negotiations over the last few months, the focus was on Iran's missile program as well, and the Iranians refused to negotiate limits on their missile program, even when they seemed willing to bend a small bit on the nuclear program. So I think that there was a sense in Trump's mind of a clock ticking. And then I think when the Israelis said, oh, and by the way, the Iranians are still not doing the work from home thing, and all of the leadership is getting together for a big meeting in the Ayatollah's compound at 7:30 a.m. for a breakfast. That was just like, okay, we're not going to have a chance like that again. So I think those factors are why now. And so let me just briefly then talk a little bit about what next, and we can go to Q&A. So far, well, the Iranians, you might ask, well, why don't the Iranians just fold, right? The Israelis have over and over again shown that they've got amazing intelligence on Iran. They know how many pairs of clean underwear the Ayatollah still has in his drawer. All right, they've obviously got this, and the Iranians have not been able to deal with it, even though for years they've been trying to do it. And then America and Israel between them have as much firepower as anybody in the history of the world has ever had, and it's all directed at you. Your people are starving. The economy is down the toilet. Why keep going? Why not just make a deal? Trump says he's a deal maker. Why not at least see what you can get? I think the Iranians think they can win. That it will be hard, it will be expensive, but that they can win. And they have two paths as they see it to victory. One is that they can, in fact, stop the oil flow long enough and cause enough trouble in the Gulf that everybody in the world, including his pollsters, will start saying to Donald Trump, you got to quit this now. All right, because again, imagine this goes on till Election Day, $5 a barrel, a gallon gas, people are miserable, Trump's polls are going way down, stock markets are down, the European economy is toast, the Japanese economy is toast, Korean economy is toast. Russia's been making money hand over fist because its oil price has gone up in a tight market. Everyone is screaming at Trump. He does not want that. And so that's one way the Iranians think they can win, is push him into that corner. The other way I think they can win is they can say, you know what, we're not going to make a deal. The only way you can get what you want from Iran is to invade, defeat, and occupy. Ground troops, baby, and lots of them. Iran is bigger than Texas. It's bigger than Iraq. It has mountains. It has deserts. It is big and hard to do. The Romans had a really hard time with the Iranians for hundreds of years. All right, it is not easy. So, what they think is that, faced with this, Trump realizes they're not going to make a deal. There's not a Delcy Rodriguez in Iran who's going to come out and say, sure, Mr. President, I'll give you what you want, you give me what I want, and let's make a deal. We'll hang together, and ultimately, before he sends in ground troops, he'll realize that he can't take us, and he will have to back down. And then we'll go back to building our ballistic missiles, and pretty soon they won't be able to attack again. Or alternatively, he sends in ground troops and we kill a bunch of them. Yeah, it'll be expensive for us. It'll be pain, but we are tough. We are not like those weak feet Americans. We are tough and hard. We can make that work. And so he'll have ground troops in here, and that'll destroy him and the Republican Party for the next 50 years. So the Iranians have a vision of victory, I think. And the question in war is each side has a vision of where things can go and a plan to get it there, right? Who's right? Who's wrong? What does each side find out as it tries to act based on its vision of victory? And this, I think, is where we are now in this war. How it's going to go, I cannot tell you. War is unpredictable, full of surprises. If you think about it, since half the people who go to war lose, it's really hard to judge. If people knew how wars would end, we'd have fewer of them. All right? People are not very good at calculating their chances in war for a whole list of reasons. So we have Trump on one side, the Ayatollahs on the other, Israel is an additional factor, the other Arab countries, European, Japanese allies, the Chinese and the Russians who have some interest here. For anybody interested in international politics, this is a chance to see the system in motion. So I would suggest to all of you that you go to good news outlets. It's not about ideology. Obviously, I think the Wall Street Journal is doing a great job in our news and coverage. But the New York Times, the Financial Times, the Economist magazine, go to smart sources. Listen to people who really seem to know something and see if you can't get better at tracking and understanding this war at real time. If it goes on for any length of time, we'll have some more meetings like this and we can kind of review it. So that's my quick overview of where we are.
Thank you.
Okay, for Q&A, raise your hand, I'll call on you. And please project your voice since you're not going to have a microphone. And what we'll do is we'll start on this side. go down this road, swing it around, and come up this road, and then go down that road. How's that? Okay, right here.
Thank you so much for speaking with us.
Louder, louder, louder.
Thank you so much for speaking with us. Can you please discuss China's role in this?
That was my question.
All right. So far, China hasn't been doing a lot. And it again, when we often think of Russia and China as acting together on these things, and they do have a common interest in weakening the United States. But when it comes to the price of oil, China and Russia have different ideas. Russia actually thinks a nice little crisis in the Middle East is not a bad thing. Drive that price of oil up, that's more money to spend on the war in Ukraine. China, where if you've been reading about it, their economists have just lowered their target rate of growth next year to the lowest rate in 30 years. All right, so China's economy is in trouble. They would like some nice cheap oil and plenty of it. So you are getting and the idea that Trump might end up being the one who decides how much oil Iran can sell and who he can sell it to is not a very popular idea in China. But right now, there's not a lot they can do. They can't send air, they don't have enough of a navy to go over and mess with the United States there. They can write angry letters to the Security Council, but this doesn't really get you anywhere. So they don't want to look, the more noise they make about it, the weaker they make themselves look. If you start yelling and screaming and you can't do anything and you're throwing a tantrum, it just advertises your weakness. So you're going to say enough to be on the record that you're not happy and your deep, profound sympathy for the struggle of the people of Iran at this critical moment and the need for international law and all of these things you're going to say. All right, but you won't mean them. And nobody's going to hold you to them. So you're not, China right now is just not doing very much. Now, I wouldn't be surprised if TikTok videos, the algorithm is going to be highlighting the Americans are monsters and what they're doing in Iran is terrible, finding ways to kind of affect American public opinion they're likely to do. Okay?
I got to ask a question. Okay, you said they can't do much, but they control a lot of our debt, T-bills, they're trying to shake the dollar as the international currency. What if they move in that direction?
You know, that is like a dirty bomb in the sense that if they started doing that, first of all right, they've got, I don't know how much, $2 trillion in debt. They've been slowly selling off. But if you start trying to sell off the American debt really fast, what happens is the price of that debt, the value of that debt goes down. So you actually end up taking huge losses yourself on everything you don't sell in the first minute. So, you know, this is actually like a sort of a, you know, they don't really have a way to use that debt weapon. They keep thinking they could, but they can't find a way, or they'd have tried something long before.
Okay, I did find the microphone, so what we're going to do is use the
Hi.
microphone.
Thank you for coming. I know you mentioned the Shah's son, and so I was curious, in an ideal situation where the regime falls and the people take over, who is the ideal person to take over, and what would like a bad power vacuum look like? Is the Shah's son somebody that can kind of come in and help facilitate that, in your opinion?
Well, he thinks so. I don't know. I think it's, you know, people who've been out of a country for a long time, and he's been out for like 50 years, are pretty much, they're like foreigners. They don't really know their way around. They don't know people. And they often have a gross misunderstanding of politics. I can imagine, though, like a constitutional monarch who doesn't try to get his father's power back, but just to kind of serve as a stabilizing force as they hold elections and stuff like that. You could see a role for him, but you would have to be a really smart politician, you know, to make that work. And I just have no idea whether or not he is. He has no experience at this kind of thing. So, we'll see. What he has going for him is there is no other figure who has, you know, who's competing with him. So it might just be he would do well in early months. Just really hard to tell.
Cool. So thank you so much for coming. Quick question: because the Iranian government right now serves as an authoritarian theocracy, male-dominated, non-democratic, and all, I just wanted your opinion on a U.S.-backed or led coup in Iran.
I don't think we could do one. I mean, in a sense, what Trump wants is you can't have a coup unless the army wants to have a coup. There's that, I don't know if you've heard the joke, how many psychiatrists does it take to change a light bulb? Only one, but the light bulb has to want to change. And, so here, like, the Americans can't just come, okay, Iranian army, have a coup, and pick somebody pick a really nice person to lead your country after the coup. We can't do that. What you can possibly do, and I think this is what Trump hopes he can do, is find a group who are willing, whether it's in the IRGC or the Army or some combination, who are willing to push everybody aside and be America's partners. But he can't make that happen. He's hoping it will happen. He's signaling with everything he's got that if you make me happy, I'll make you happy, but we haven't seen it.
Anyone else in this room?
Thank you. I guess I'm gonna start with thanks for coming over. So I guess I should say that too. Thanks for coming and speaking to us. My question is, how likely is it that you mentioned in the beginning that that there's a lot of risk in this, right? And a lot of things could cause Trump support to fall dramatically. So how likely is it that this is a bluff, like he did with Greenland or something?
Well, I think he's gone up until he started bombing, people thought it was a bluff. Could have been a bluff. All right. But now he's in so deep that if he has to get something now, or it will look like he backed down. You see what I mean? So it's sort of his bluff stage is over. He's on to something else.
Actually, just a very quick follow-up to that. One thing I think he might still be bluffing on is you'll notice every so often at a news conference they'll ask, are you going to put American ground troops in? And of course, all the Republicans on Congress are like, no, absolutely not. But President Trump and Secretary of War, Defense, whatever it is today, Hegseth keeps saying, well, maybe we'll put ground troops in. And I
never say never.
Never say never. And I personally think they are saying that because I know that Iranians are listening, but behind closed doors are like, that would be an absolute disaster. Right. But I can't prove it.
Right.
But that's my prediction.
They could also find themselves into a position where it would be such a humiliation
right.
that they could be trapped.
They're
trapped into their bluff.
Yeah,
so it's
absolutely.
Hi, thank you so much for coming. You previously mentioned how, similar to the situation in Venezuela, Trump might decide to go against the democratic version, so like Reza Shah, and choose to negotiate with the current regime. Can you further explain why he would go that route instead of going the more democratic version when the regime hasn't been cooperating whatsoever in the past couple months?
Well, I'd say first of all, Reza Pahlavi is not the Democratic option. Nobody's ever elected him to anything. I don't know, maybe he got elected to the student council when he was in school, right? So it's not like in Venezuela where you have a democratically elected, internationally recognized leader. It's the government or question mark. And so that makes it, from Trump's point of view, it would just be so much easier if there's a group in the government now who are basically willing to come to terms. And because of that, they can expect a very handsome price for doing what he would like them to do. But on the other hand, the minute any of the Ayatollahs or whatever thought somebody else was going to do that, boom. So it's a very high stakes game, as it was in Venezuela, where, you know, all kinds of things are moving around. No one trusts anybody else. No one knows what anybody else is going to be doing. Stakes are high, and you're getting, in the Iranian case, you're getting bombed every day, and they're going after the leadership, so you might not even be around tomorrow. So they're in a very, very difficult psychological space too.
I had a question for you. So I appreciate you coming here and your lecture or seminar about Davos. One of the things I wanted to ask you is strongly worded, but do you think that this kind of streamlining of the idea that kind of like might is right in terms of like taking Maduro and taking out the Ayatollah is going to make someone like China start rubbing their hands together and looking at Taiwan? Or
No, because I don't think China was sitting around saying, oh, I'd love to take Taiwan, but America's shining moral example is so radiant that I would die of shame if I reached out my hand to that little island. I don't think that matters at all. Now, I do think that in a time when international life is orderly and people are not doing dramatic things, it's a little harder to just kind of get yourself up to the place where you do it. But that's not the same as moral example. And I think the world order was already kind of in a state of upheaval before Donald Trump. And what's driving those changes, it isn't Donald Trump. It's, as the Chinese say, change is not seen in 100 years. So that, you know, the instability is kind of a background. So I don't think it matters at all, that argument.
Thank you for coming today, sir. My question, you mentioned earlier about how a lot of people in the institution, they're no longer as, I suppose, like their morals are not as strongly as before. Now they're more focused on the economic stuff, and that's what their point of doing the oil takeover is. Who do you think is the most important people to be talking to in that government to ensure that, well, a negotiation will take place, that further escalation doesn't happen?
You know, it's, I think when Alexander the Great was on his deathbed, you know, they wanted him to name someone as his successor. You know, who do you pick to run the empire after you? And I think what he said was, supposedly said was, to the quickest. You know, this is one of the situations in the world where, in a sense, there aren't any rules. We've just wiped out the top leadership of Iran, something like the 50 top people. You know, this is, you know, so who's in charge? And who agrees on who's in charge? And so you've got this kind of free-form competition taking place. And, you know, how do they reach out and contact the United States? How does the United States know that these people aren't just trying to like fool you, right? Or also that they're able to deliver on what they say they're going to deliver on. This stuff is very tricky. I am assuming there are some back channels out there somewhere, and the Israelis do have a lot of insight into what goes on in Iran. So but the one thing I think we can all be sure of is that those of us who are just kind of reading newspapers and watching this from the outside are not really going to know until something happens.
Hi, I have the mic over here. Thank you for both you guys for coming here. I took your class last spring, and it was great. So I'm happy to hear you speak again, and Dr. Hulme as well. So you mentioned the irrationality, almost absurdity of Iran continuing this war. You know, considering they've lost all their proxies, their nuclear facilities are wiped out, the Ayatollah is dead, and you mentioned that they possibly see a path to victory, but do you also see a role of ideology, maybe Shia martyrdom? How strong of a role do you think this plays in them perpetuating this war?
Well, that's a very good question, and again, that's an answer about individual psychology. You know, because this Ayatollah here may be just waiting to go to his reward, eternal reward, and prays every night, "Oh God, give me the privilege of martyrdom." This Ayatollah over here says, "Oh yes, me too," but doesn't really, feel it, okay? And that's true in sort of every religious institution and all of this. And there's really no way to tell. Probably the last Ayatollah, the late Ayatollah, seems actually to have been motivated in that way. He did not go into hiding, knowing that the Israelis were after him and stuff like that. And he may have felt that the example of his heroic death would be, his legacy. But one can be reasonably sure that they're not unanimously united on that. And the question is whether the dissenters can mobilize something. We just don't know. I don't know. It may be there's somebody in Mossad, somebody in the CIA who knows. I don't know.
Building off of what he said a little bit, how much of this could be that Iran was setting it up in terms of a trap under a quasi like Ketsugo plan where, as you were saying, they're trying to take as many missiles as they can right now. But I wonder if the long-term goal for them isn't actually dislodging the American presence. It's getting a lot of the allies that surround them right now to feel less protected by the U.S. And then number two, overwhelm Israeli missile defenses in order to keep attacking Israel.
Right. Well, I think they would like to do both of those things, but I don't think they can do them now. They don't seem to, even though today there was an uptick in their missile rates, they really don't seem to have the power to achieve that strategy. And again, that would be one reason that the people who wanted to do this now in the U.S. and in Israel would say, do it now, because the longer we wait, the more likely it is that they will be able to try that. And that may well have been what they were building to by building up their missile capabilities. But I think that right now they do hope that they can force the United States into a defeat, either through interdiction of oil or through refusing to do regime change without a big occupation and stuff, which they think they might win anyway. If they achieve that, then they would use that power to go ahead and put themselves into a position to do what you're suggesting. I do think that's kind of their goal. I don't think that they've got the ability to do that right yet. Make sense?
Okay, I'd like to add something as a military historian. I think the American public's got to weigh what we're receiving from the government, from Trump and Hegseth, and consider that command and control in Iran has not collapsed. Missiles are still being fired. So what? 50 lead clerics are dead, but the command and control system is still going. Missiles are still being fired, and that's why you hear people like President Trump and Hegseth say, "Well, this could take 4 weeks or more," and Americans get real burned out on following and supporting things like this. So I think it's in all of our favor to understand that yes, we're winning the war, but we haven't won the war. Winning the war is when command and control of Iranian forces comes to an end, and they're just wandering around like the Iraqi army was wandering around.
And they seem to have used their time since the summer war, the 12-day war, to decentralize command and control, which, so that they can continue to launch. On the other hand, it may not be so much central command and control, it's just people are following their existing orders, which then also will make it harder for the center, when they reconstitute a center, to tell everybody to stop. You can get in a little situation like we had in World War II, after World War II, where there were isolated Japanese units on different Pacific islands that didn't know the war was over. And even 20 years later, Japanese soldiers hiding in the jungles on various islands would become. I can remember this as a kid. This would be happening. It's like, what? The war's over? So, the loss of command and control is a success for Iran in that they're able to keep fighting after the liquidation or the mass death of their leaders, but they're not necessarily able to act on political grounds.
And just to follow up on that quickly, so on one of Secretary Rubio, of course a good UF alumnus there, on one of his press conferences a couple days ago, he made this exact point that they had delegated a lot of the release authority down the chain of command exactly for this reason, and it was from the 12-day war in June. So I think it remains to be seen how much of that kind of central command structure exists. To the kind of second point that Professor Legere had on how, essentially, is how long is the American public going to be okay with this? And already the public opinion polls are not very much in favor of this. And so what history suggests is that a president can get away with things when they're not very costly. And we talk about blood and treasure, but really blood being American lives, treasure being money. We actually, it really is a lot more about blood, American blood, maybe a little bit, like, wow, it's really expensive. So I think
Gas prices are
well, that is true. If it's really influencing individual Americans, so gas prices would be one, or American combat casualties. And so I think last I checked, there were 6 Americans killed, which is not a ton, but it's more than 0. And in fact, if you look at President Trump's military interventions that he initiated, not the ones he inherited, Afghanistan, ISIS, he inherited those. The ones he initiated, if you look all the way back in his first term, this is actually the first time there's been a single American combat death. So now you're at 6, right? So it's not a lot, but I'm sure he's worried about this. And that's why I don't think he doesn't want ground troops, because he doesn't want that number getting higher, because that's going to hurt him. And I think absolutely the oil prices is another thing that's going to hurt him. So I think that's what's going to affect public opinion.
Thanks, both, for your guys' talk. My question is on the Kurdish option. I've heard in the news that there's discussion of arming the Kurdish forces in northwest Iran, and my understanding is that those groups would be maybe just as likely to destabilize Iraq and Turkey. And I was wondering if you could kind of make sense of that. Is that a legitimate kind of option for the presidency to undermine Iran, or do you see that as more as a bluff, or what are the repercussions of that?
Well, as far as I can tell, they have in fact armed Kurds. And it looks as if what had happened was, it's not actually that nice to be a Kurd in Iran. And in the Kurdish areas of Iraq, the Kurds have been running things since the Iraq War. And so there's been a number of refugees and migration out from Iran into Iraqi Kurdistan. And as I understand it, those are the people that have been armed to sort of go home. And you're quite right that this is a really dangerous thing to play with. And the dangers are partly that the Turks and the Iraqis might be unhappy, though if what the Iranian Kurds are doing is saying, no, we want to be like the Iraqi Kurds and have an autonomous region without leaving the country, that worries the Turks less. Also, the Turks really hate the Syrian Kurds and the PKK, which is the organization that's been leading a Kurdish guerrilla war in Turkey. But the Kurds over on the Iranian-Iraqi side are not governed in the same way. They're these kind of neo-Stalinist leadership that the Syrian Kurds and the PKK have, and so on. So it's a different kettle of Kurds. So but in some ways, this playing with the ethnic politics of Iran, only about 50% of the population of Iran are ethnic Persians. So the rest are, there are a lot, about a third is Azeris. Then there are Kurds, there are Balochs who live in the kind of east of Iran. So there are a lot of different groups in there. The Azeris actually are the most concerning, probably. Azerbaijan, which is the nation state of the Azeris, would very much like to be bigger and to bring freedom and liberation to its oppressed brethren under the Persian yoke. And the Iranians, or let's say a drone hit an airfield in Azerbaijan today. And the Azerbaijan government is making quite a big deal out of this. To me, it is not entirely clear that there was a rational reason for an Iranian missile a drone to go toward a civilian airport in an Azerbaijani exclave south of Armenia. This could be staged. But the Azerbaijan is also extremely close to Israel. It's a Shia Islamic country where if you walk down on the streets I've been to Baku and some other places in Azerbaijan, you'll actually see people waving the Star of David. The Israeli ambassador, who by the way is a Christian, is very popular, Christian Arab, is very popular in Azerbaijan. And they have very close intelligence cooperation and stuff like this. So I think part of this might be Trumpian saber rattling. The ground troops don't have to be American now, do they? But also the problem might well be that this could unite a lot of ethnic Persians and other Iranians who don't want to see the country descend, don't want it to be the new Yugoslavia and have ethnic wars of secession for years. So I have every confidence that Pete Hegseth, our Secretary of War, has looked very deeply into all of these matters. And so everything is just going to be fine, okay?
Thank you for being here. My question is a little kind of on a side topic, kind of related to this, but it's regarding Cuba. Trump in recent press conferences, he's been talking about Cuba, and also Marco Rubio. Trump mentioned, for example, like we're going to come in, we're going to do a friendly takeover of Cuba. What do you think that would entail? Does that mean like choking them out economically, obviously with their loss of Venezuelan oil, or does that mean doing something similar to what they did in Venezuela, like taking out the leadership and trying to negotiate with some other people in the government? Or do you think it's like full regime change? Kind of what do you think the Trump administration is looking forward or like looking towards in terms of dealing with Cuba?
Yeah, I think it is likely that they do see some form of a changing regime. Again, Cuba is very different from Venezuela, and the army there has, is I think, the Venezuelan state was unbelievably incompetent. I mean, you think about a petro state that lets its oil industry collapse by corruption and bad management. How do you think those people were running everything? It's not a surprise that Venezuelan leaders brought in Cuban security because they knew how bad they were at this stuff. And so in that sense, the Cuban government is going to probably look to Trump like a tougher nut to crack. But on the other hand, Venezuela has oil and Cuba doesn't. So it's politically stronger, but economically weaker. And I can't imagine Trump not wanting to use that leverage. Again, from Trump's point of view, Eisenhower tried to stop Castro, he failed. Kennedy tried, he failed. Every American president since 1959 has been worried about this. I have solved it. That's exactly the kind of thing that appeals to Trump. And I think there can't be many people in Cuba who think that their current government is the best government they could have. I think that, that we see this is a government that, probably would have been better for everybody if it collapsed after the failure of the Soviet Union. It's just dragged on and on. Nobody believes in the ideology. You have an army that doesn't, that basically an army that's economically motivated, I think, at this point. And so we may be playing let's make a deal. I don't know.
Thank you for being here today. I guess a two-part question. So given how you've talked about other powers in the Middle East, especially Turkey, Azerbaijan, perhaps Saudi Arabia, having smaller conflicts, how do you expect the vacuum left by the much smaller presence Iran has to be settled in the future? And second of all, do you believe that Iran will ever truly be settled in a way that perhaps Syria has been? Or do you expect a situation more similar to Afghanistan where rebel factions are constantly engaging whatever the new government is?
Okay. Well, I'd say, first of all, I think Syria also has still got some rebel factions engaging. So, and probably the Taliban is more secure in Afghanistan than the current Syrian government is in Damascus, I think. It's hard to say. Iran, Persia is a 2,500-year-old entity, and it keeps coming back. And the culture, the history, the language have deep, rich associations, and not just in Iran itself. You travel up into Central Asia, down into India, and the cultural influence of Persia is immense. So I think while Iraq is a much more fragile entity, Iraq and Syria basically never existed in anything like their current boundaries, except as a result of the Sykes-Picot Agreement and kind of colonial Europe drawing lines on a map. And the people there don't necessarily have a deep sense of themselves as being a people. And while there is a lot, there are different ethnic groups and so on in Persia, Persia is more of a thing than either Iraq or Syria is. And so I think that tends to make me think that the chances for some form of organization to cohere are stronger there than in some of these other places. But I'm not putting a timetable on it, right? I just think there'll be a tendency to to reassemble itself in some ways. And I think on the whole, that would be a good thing. I don't think the United States actually benefits from having a lot of tiny little weak countries that are always fighting with each other and sources of instability and things like that, but we'll see.
Thank you so much for talking with us today. I had a question about the midterms. Roughly.
Oh, you mean the congressional ones, not the
I read that roughly 60% of Americans don't approve of this war, or military action, however you want to call it. How realistic do you think it would be that this turns out either well or well in time for it to be beneficial in the midterms for the Republican Party?
Again, if I could figure out stuff like that, I wouldn't be talking to you guys. I would be in a room somewhere with a Bloomberg terminal, like betting on like different stock futures and things like this. You wouldn't see me, all right? You might see my private jet flying over the campus, perhaps. So what I would say there is that as long as things are looking good by about Labor Day, probably Trump comes out of this at least okay and maybe a bit stronger. If things have gone pear-shaped, as they say, and are staying pear-shaped past Labor Day, every day makes the damage bigger. That would just be my quick and dirty thinking.
And I also just with that, again, I think the amount of American casualties and how much it costs the American consumer. So again, the oil thing. I think those will be the keys on that.
I wouldn't be surprised to see Trump do things if this starts to drag on a bit, like trying to get a tax holiday on the federal gas tax and trying to get states to do things like that to bring the price down. I think we would see a lot of activity on his part to try to limit this damage.
There's some famous political science papers showing like what determines the outcome of elections, and what like the two by far biggest variables are if there's a war, how many dead Americans are there, and then things like essentially inflation and just cost of living going up. Those are the main things that determine election outcomes.
You know, not getting killed and having money.
Exactly.
I mean,
What a thing.
makes a certain amount of intuitive sense.
Okay, thank you so much for being here. Quick question regarding drone warfare. We've seen its utilization within Ukraine. We've seen how effective it is in smaller powers with weaker technology generally to be able to maintain themselves. With Iran's usage of Shahed drones, do we see this as the new era of guerrilla warfare? Is this how weaker powers or weaker technological powers are going to start waging wars? And then how do we respond to it? The drones are breaking through our traditional anti-missile defenses. What do we do in the future, I guess?
Well, that is a really interesting question. And a couple of years ago, I went to Ukraine and actually went to some of the factories where they were building drones. And what you would see is they were directly connected to information from the battlefield. So every time the Russians came up with something new, the Ukrainians, like within hours, are trying to work on a countermeasure. And obviously there's something on the Russian side where they're doing the same thing. I was not invited to visit those facilities. But I think there's still, I am not sure that drones are going to be the kind of the little guy's magic weapon here, because what you can do, especially with sort of slaved AI and coordination. One of the things about F-35s, for example, is they are not just themselves planes that fire things. They are kind of, they act to work in concert with all kinds of craft and drone, manned and unmanned, so you can just bring a lot of stuff to bear. So it is not, to me, at all clear who's going to ultimately win the technological stuff. And if it's a contest to make drones, once we get our act together, we can make a lot more than Iran. So we'll see. But it is, I mean, when we think particularly about the future of conflict, say in Africa, poorer and poorer insurgencies are going to have access to better and better weapons. And I think we have to brace for rising levels of violence and death in the wars that are likely coming there.
Thank you again for coming today. I know Hamas, Hezbollah, and the Houthis all receive financial backing very heavily from Iran. And if the sort of backing dries up because Iran is now fighting their own war, what sort of happens towards their relationship to Israel, especially domestically? Is there any change at all?
Who's, Hamas and Hezbollah or Iran's?
The Hamas and Hezbollah.
I think I don't see Hamas being. I think for Hamas, the identification with resistance is going to stay. Hezbollah, the Lebanese are now trying to disarm Hezbollah. We'll see how that goes. On the brighter side, I suppose, from Hezbollah's point of view, they have fewer people to divide up the money among. So the fact they're getting less from Iran, I think we will see. we will see these organizations finding new strategies of survival. I would not be surprised, by the way, if the Houthis weren't getting paid off by certain governments not to fire at their ships in the Red Sea and stuff like that. So, you know, when you have a lot of guns and a lot of fighter and missiles and fighters who are willing and able to use them, you can often find somebody who's going to help you pay your bills.
So evidently burden sharing has been a really big factor for the Trump administration's foreign policy pedagogy. And I'm trying to understand like the bigger picture of like U.S.-Israeli cooperation here and what that means like for how the administration can like celebrate this model of like regional cooperation with the Europeans and particularly like the Taiwanese for how they can leverage their own power, you know, to like exert like self-determination against larger adversaries in the region. So I'm curious like what you think about this model and if the Taiwanese or the Europeans or even like the Ukrainians are looking at, you know, the level of cooperation that there was between the US and Israel in this matter, you know, to be fairly successful at the beginning, like how are they viewing this moving forward?
I think it's more, you know, what they're seeing is that the amount of support you get from the United States depends on your own ability. You know, so that if the Israelis hadn't been able to clear out Iran's air defenses, I'm not sure that Trump would have bombed Iran back in the summer. And if the Israelis hadn't been able to say, okay, the Ayatollah and his top aides are all having a breakfast meeting in this room, I don't know that the Americans would have been supportive of what's happening now. So, and this is the way Trump likes his allies. He likes allies who are more worried about the problem than you are, and so are like doing more about it. And they're asking you to like supplement their help, but they're doing the hard part. They're making it easier. They're paying you to help them, not expecting you to pay them to allow you to help them. So in that sense, Israel is the example for a lot of American allies on how do you maintain effective relations with the U.S. in the age of Trump, and I suspect after Trump as well. It's sort of like this is how states should behave. The other thing that's definitely happening is that even more countries are interested in defense relations with Israel. You know, we've heard a lot about how unpopular Israel has become in Europe, especially as a result of the Gaza war. But German Chancellor Merz has been speaking in public about the need to deepen defense ties with Israel based on his understanding of what it is that the Israelis have. So I think the lesson to every country is you got to take care of yourself before you can expect other people to help you.
And just to add on to that, just two quick things. So first, Professor Rogachevsky, we actually wanted him to come tonight. Unfortunately, he couldn't be here. But one thing he was emphasizing to me earlier today is that this was really one of the first times, if not the first time in Israeli military history, where they really had a coordinated, full-on integrated operation with another country. So usually they're really doing stuff on their own. We would have given them supplies, but 73 war, 6-day war, it's them on their own. And then second, just to really put a apostrophe on this point about, the Trump administration can point to Israel as like a model partner ally. What's all the more interesting about this is, as many of you I'm guessing know, we don't actually have a formal, legal, written down military alliance with Israel, which is in contrast to what we have with NATO. Of course, we have NATO Article 5. So it's just another thing to say, look, we're not even formal allies, and yet we see them as doing more. Maybe is that going to change the relationships we want to have with other countries going into the future?
More flexible and
Exactly. Yes. And then that of course, there's the Taiwan question.
My question is also in relation to quote unquote burden sharing. We're seeing more and more Iranian missiles hit neighboring Arab countries, specifically the UAE, for example. How do you think we're going to see these countries react as a response and possibly even try, one, in defending themselves, but maybe looking and saying, this Iran is not an Iran that's going to play nice with us either?
Well, I do think that this has been a wake-up call. But again, most of the strikes were at American bases on the territories of these countries. So, and they could have, if the Iranians had attacked the desalinization plants, that would have been a huge problem. And so the fact that, in a sense, they're being restrained even in a situation of war is a message that others are receiving. It's, you know, the Americans tend to think of problems in international life as you have a problem, then you solve it, and then you move on because we go back to peace. In much of the world, people think, you know, we've always had problems with the people across the river or the people down the road or whatever. We're never going to solve it. So we just try to live with it in the least painful way for us. But it's never going away. The Americans will lose interest in the Middle East, but the Iranians are not leaving Iran. And so there are lots of sort of back channels and unspoken understandings and things that Americans are often kind of blind to in these situations.
And just on the question of why has Iran shot missiles, so some of it is at American bases in these countries, but some of it has been at like hotels. And there's this question of why are they doing this? And so, of course, we can't get in their minds, but I'm suspicious of what we were talking about with Professor Legere before, where they had delegated this command authority down to commanders, and in the fog of war, you don't know what's necessarily going on. And so there's some famous work on this, for example, during the Cuban Missile Crisis. We're trying to figure out what the Soviets are doing, and the Cubans, they're trying to figure out what we're doing, and we assume that everything the adversary is doing, it's like rational and well thought out, they're doing it. And what you find out in a lot of these circumstances is it's just like
Some
random
local
people,
guy, yeah.
random, yeah, exactly, just doing things. And from the outside, you think, oh, there must be some master plan, and sometimes there's just not. It's war is you have, I'm probably using these terms wrong, friction, fog of war, things that, you know, a single rational actor might not do, but because of these huge military bureaucracies, you'll get these kind of random things happen.
Or the absence of the bureaucracy.
Yeah, or that, yeah.
Right,
yeah.
so, you know, it's just like, you're the lieutenant, you're in charge of this firing battery, and there's no one giving you orders. The last orders you had were keep firing.
Right. And and the 50 people at the top of the chain are all dead now. And you don't even know that. No one's answering the phone.
That's exaggerating for effect. So you can't have a lone lieutenant firing all kinds of missiles 24/7.
Well, yeah, okay, fair enough. Anyways.
My question is actually along similar lines to where you ended up discussing, but reflecting more on America's role in this. You laid out the argument earlier that you think Trump's in the driver's seat and that he sort of had some idea of this planned out, and that lines up with how he's acted with Venezuela. He comes into negotiations. Within a week or two, he comes in, does military involvement. But the administration has done a very poor job communicating that, if that was their plan. We've seen over the first 3 days, I think it was over 3 different stories. And one of the more concerning ones came out of Marco Rubio when he said, if we didn't do this, it was going to be worse. Yeah. If we weren't going to start this war, someone else was going to strike, implying Israel. So we've said
he even said Israel.
Oh, did he actually say that?
Yeah. He said we knew that they were going to strike, and so we had to. And the Iranians were going to strike us, so we had to strike Iran first.
I didn't remember that, but that sounds in line with what I took away from hearing him speak. And Trump afterwards has talked about how when he was asked on the Air Force One, who do you want to be in charge after this? He said, oh, we had some guys in mind, and they're dead now. Yeah. So, right. How much of that reflects a lack of a grand vision for how we're interacting with this, and how much of that is the chaos of war? The moment we started, everything goes out the window and it becomes a fly by the seat of our pants.
I think there's something else to include in that, which is that Trump, as I think many of us will have noticed by now, does not think of speech as a way to convey accurate information, accurate factual information. I'm serious. You know, that his sort of early life as a real estate guy in New York, you never tell you don't want the other people to know what your bottom line is. And that would be magnified in war. You do not, you know, the press asks you a question, you're not going to give them your secret plan. You're not going to give them your thinking. So, and yet, you know, there's a kind of an earnestness in the commentary, you know, I got to stitch this together into a kind of a coherent picture. So even if he had a vision, which he may or may not have, he wouldn't tell you. And in fact, he would try to deliberately mislead you because there's no way he can tell it to you without the Iranians hearing about it. So, especially when bluff plays a big part. So I think it's important not to let ourselves be driven crazy trying to parse out, these Delphic oracle kinds of remarks that, are intended to deceive and confuse. What I think we can do, again, is look at patterns. I don't think Trump had, I am as close to 100% sure as I can be that Trump doesn't have a little memorandum book that he carries around where he's got his grand plan, this is step 17B, subparagraph 2, okay? That's not what's happening. And I imagine that, when he went into Venezuela, he didn't know what would be coming next, but when it worked out okay, that was a factor in making him think maybe I can do something in Iran too. And so he's completely opportunistic and pragmatic and power-seeking in the moments. And he evaluates his options in the moment, takes what he thinks is the most favorable one, and over time, in retrospect, you can see patterns, but he may not be conscious of the patterns that he's making. Does that make sense? Good, because I think that's actually what's going on.
All right, let's give our speakers another round of applause.